before you start believing that madness destroyed kingdoms, consider this. What if the most dangerous rulers in history weren't insane at all? They were perfectly, terrifyingly sane. And that's exactly what made them so devastating. Most channels love to tell you that King George III's madness lost America. That Emperor Caligula's insanity turned Rome into a nightmare. King Charles VI's mental illness fractured France. But here's what they're leaving out. The real horror of absolute monarchy wasn't psychological breakdown. It was rational cruelty dressed up as divine right, calculated evil wearing a crown. The truth is far more disturbing than madness could ever be. When we diagnose dead kings with mental illness, actually make them less dangerous in our minds. We tell ourselves that a mad king is unpredictable, uncontrollable, almost pitiable. What about the rulers who knew exactly what they were doing? What about the ones who chose suffering, who engineered famines on purpose, murdered hundreds and slept soundly because it was all part of a grand strategy? Let me take you to 16th century Spain. King Philip II, not mad, broken, completely functional. Possibly the most methodical, intelligent ruler of his age. And yet, he orchestrated one of the longest, most meticulous campaigns of religious terror Europe had ever seen. He didn't lose his mind during the Spanish Inquisition. He created it, refined it, he perfected it with the precision of an accountant balancing books, except those books were written in human suffering. Philip II was methodical to the point of neurosis. He read every document. He made every decision personally. Organized his desk with obsessive precision. By all modern psychological standards, he would be considered entirely mentally sound. He chose to burn people alive for believing the wrong version of Christianity. He did this not in fits of madness, but through calculated policy, planning, and detailed paperwork. The Spanish Inquisition wasn't the raving of a deranged mind, it was the cold machinery of a rational one. This is where history becomes truly horrifying. Because if we accept that some of the worst rulers in history were completely sane, we have to accept something terrible. Evil doesn't require madness. It requires only ambition, power, and the absence of consequences. It requires someone willing to look at human suffering and decide it's a worthwhile cost. Consider Ivan the Terrible of Russia. We call him terrible. Here's what's interesting. Psychologists who've studied his life note that he showed signs of genuine paranoia. Sure. Cruelty wasn't random. It wasn't the flailing of a broken mind. It followed a pattern. It had purpose. He eliminated threats systematically, consolidated power methodically. He used terror as a tool, not as a symptom. In 1570, Ivan attacked the city of Novgorod. Historical accounts describe it as a massacre, but it wasn't a spontaneous rampage. It was a planned military campaign to crush a potential center of rebellion. Thousands died, yes, but they died as part of a coherent strategy, not because Ivan woke up one day hearing voices telling him to kill. The psychologists who diagnosed him with madness were working backward from his actions, assuming that such cruelty must indicate mental illness. But that's a logical trap. Cruelty doesn't require insanity. Ambition doesn't require a broken mind. Power corrupts sane people just as effectively, perhaps more so. They never question their own rationality. Now, let's talk about the rulers who really were mentally unwell, and why that matters even more. Here's the counterintuitive truth. The mad kings often ended up being less destructive than the sane ones, simply because their instability made them erratic. They couldn't execute a long-term plan, couldn't maintain the machinery of systematic oppression. Their madness was chaotic and chaos, while terrible in the moment eventually collapses. Truly dangerous rulers were the ones who remained rational enough to maintain control, but ruthless enough to exercise it without mercy. The ones who built empires on bones. They're the ones whose systems of oppression lasted centuries. They're the ones we should actually fear. Louis XI of France, a man often described as paranoid and mentally unstable. But look closer at what he actually did. Didn't randomly execute people. He methodically eliminated the feudal nobles who threatened his centralized power. Was he paranoid? Possibly. Was he also right to be suspicious? Absolutely. He was dealing with constant conspiracies. He faced real threats. Madness was actually extreme political awareness in a world where paranoia was occasionally justified. Horror isn't in the diagnosis. It's in the realization that some of history's worst atrocities weren't committed by madmen, but by calculating ones. They knew what they were doing. They understood the consequences. Simply didn't care because the system gave them absolute permission to not care. And this is where the narrative gets truly uncomfortable for us. If we're willing to say that most horrible rulers were probably mentally ill, then we can distance ourselves from them. We can say, well, could never be me because I'm sane. But what if the real danger comes from sanity? What if a perfectly rational person, absolute power, and no accountability naturally becomes monstrous? This is the question historians have avoided for centuries. It's easier to blame madness than to confront the possibility that evil doesn't need a broken mind. It just needs the right circumstances. Needs power without accountability. It needs a system that refuses to question authority. It needs people willing to follow orders. Consider for a moment the reign of Leopold II of Belgium. By all contemporary accounts, Leopold was not insane. He was educated, articulate, politically savvy. He spoke multiple languages, he attended galas, he had a family, he was, by the standards of his day, a perfectly rational man. Personal rule over the Congo Free State resulted in the deaths of an estimated 10 million people. 10 million. In the span of just 30 years, the atrocities committed weren't spontaneous, they weren't the ravings of a deranged mind, they were systematic, calculated, economic. When rubber production didn't meet quotas, he didn't have a psychotic episode. He had people's hands cut off. This was policy. It was business. This was a sane man making rational decisions based on profit, indifference, and the complete absence of consequences. Here's what makes Leopold genuinely terrifying. He was not unusual, not in his time, not in the way he thought. The machinery of European imperialism was built on the same cold logic, the same rationalization. Only difference between Leopold and dozens of other colonial rulers was that he was more thorough, more isolated in his control, unfortunately for history, more documented in his cruelty. This brings us to something far more dangerous than any individual tyrant's broken mind. It brings us to the concept of systemic madness, a culture, a government, civilization that collectively agrees to act in ways that are objectively insane, yet maintains the appearance of complete rationality. The Nazi regime is the most obvious example, but let's think deeper about how it actually functioned. Hitler himself had severe personality disorders and likely suffered from physical ailments that affected his cognition. But the Holocaust didn't happen because Hitler was insane. It happened because thousands of supposedly normal, educated, rational people were willing to follow orders. Bureaucrats, soldiers, engineers, doctors. We've documented the psychological evaluations. We know that the majority of people who participated in genocide were not psychopaths. They were ordinary. Some were even well-meaning, compartmentalized. They convinced themselves they were doing what was necessary. They believed in the system they were part of. After World War II, there was this desperate hope among psychologists and judges that we could prove these perpetrators were sick, fundamentally defective in some way. It would have been comforting. It would have created a clear line between them and us. But the clinical evidence didn't support it. Most were psychologically normal. Some were even intelligent and cultured. Discovery didn't make us feel safer. It made us realize something far more disturbing. Evil at scale doesn't require a broken mind. It requires systems that enable broken behavior. It requires ideology that justifies it. It requires people willing to participate. And those people? Us. They could be any of us. Let's look at another ruler who managed to be absolutely sane while being absolutely devastating. Vlad III, commonly known as Vlad the Impaler. Now, popular culture has largely written him as a bloodthirsty madman. Stoker created Dracula. Based loosely on his legend, we imagine a crazed tyrant, driven by uncontrollable bloodlust. The reality? Vlad was a military strategist. Every impalement was strategic. When Ottoman forces approached his territory, thousands of stakes erected with his enemies mounted upon them. Not out of insanity, but as psychological warfare, as a clear message. This is what awaits you if you invade my lands. His cruelty had purpose, his violence had calculation. Contemporary accounts by German merchants actually describe him as an efficient administrator. He was beloved by his own people because he brought stability and order through fear. Peasants felt protected by his ruthlessness against foreign invasion. He was, by the standards of his brutal era, doing his job. Tells us is fundamental. The worst rulers in history aren't always the ones with the least grip on reality. Often, they're the ones with the strongest grip. They're the ones who see the world most clearly through the lens of power, who understand exactly what they're doing and do it anyway. But we've been avoiding the truly uncomfortable question. If mental illness isn't the root cause of tyranny, what is? If sanity doesn't protect us from monsters, what does? Answer lies in something psychologists and historians have been documenting for decades but rarely discuss in popular culture. It's called the power paradox. And it works like this. As a person gains power, their capacity for empathy actually diminishes. Because they were born cruel, but because power changes the brain itself. Studies have shown that when people gain positions of authority, regions of their brains responsible for perspective taking and emotional empathy literally show reduced activation, become neurologically less able to imagine themselves in others' shoes. They see people beneath them as categories rather than individuals, resources rather than humans. This isn't madness, this is adaptation. The human brain adapts to the environment it's in. When you're told constantly that you're superior, that your decisions are unquestionable, that normal rules don't apply to you, your brain restructures itself to match that narrative. It's not illness, it's function. Problem is that it functions in ways that are deeply harmful to everyone below. Caligula is a perfect example of the power paradox in action. He became emperor at just 24 years old. Historical accounts suggest he was not immediately insane. In fact, first months were relatively stable. But as absolute power consolidated in his hands, something shifted. Sense of his own godhood became more pronounced. His inability to understand or care about human suffering became complete. Within a few years, was reportedly having entire families executed for minor slights. He was declaring himself a god, was hosting grotesque parties where the wealthy were forced to participate in humiliation. These were symptoms of a power-drunk mind, but they developed gradually. They weren't always there. The position itself created them. Now, this is where I need to pause and address something crucial. If power naturally corrupts our capacity for empathy, absolute power makes it nearly impossible to remain human, then what does that tell us about our own leaders? About our own systems? There's a resource in the description and the pinned comment that goes much deeper into how power actually restructures society if you want to understand the mechanics of this corruption. Because here's what most history books won't tell you. The worst rulers didn't create the systems of oppression they lived in. They inherited them, expanded them, perfected them. Didn't invent the machinery. That machinery already existed. They just had the opportunity to use it fully. Is why studying mad rulers is somewhat of a historical distraction. It makes us feel removed from the danger. Studying sane rulers, rational ones who made calculated choices, that forces us to confront something more frightening. It forces us to ask, under different circumstances, with different power structures and different incentives, could I do what they did? Could any reasonable person? Answer, which the evidence increasingly suggests, is yes, but not because we're secretly broken, because the systems we build are broken. Power without accountability is a poison that affects the brain itself. Because empathy is fragile, isolation from consequence can erode it completely in a disturbingly short amount of time. Is the uncomfortable truth that separates the darkest chapters of history from simple tales of monsters. The monsters were made, built by peace, by the very structures that gave them infinite power and removed their ability to face consequence. Consider what we know about the psychology of isolation. In modern studies, when subjects are placed in positions of unchecked authority over others, even in brief laboratory settings, their behavior shifts dramatically, become less empathetic, more dismissive, more willing to inflict discomfort on those beneath them. This happens not because cruel people seek power, but because power itself changes people. A king surrounded by yes-men and sycophants never hears the word no. His worst impulses are never challenged, they're celebrated. Paranoia is validated. His suspicions are investigated. His cruelties are rationalized as necessary. And over years, over decades, kings stopped seeing the people below him as fully human. The 16th century Spanish king Philip II exemplified this perfectly. He wasn't born mad. He inherited a vast empire and spent his reign in the Escorial Palace, A fortress of bureaucracy he built himself. Surrounded only by advisors and guards, he signed death warrants by the hundreds without ever meeting the condemned. Secretary once reported that Philip would read through lists of executions while eating breakfast, completely unmoved. Was Philip II insane? Medical historians have debated this for centuries. But the more relevant question is, sanity even matter when the system removes all friction between impulse and action, when there are no witnesses to suffering, no accountability, possibility of refusal? The patterns repeat across civilizations and centuries. The Japanese Emperor Caligula's Roman predecessor, Tiberius, withdrew to the island of Capri in his final years, effectively disappearing from public life. From there, he ruled through agents and paranoia, never seeing the people he governed. Absence didn't make him kinder, it made him crueler. Or take the case of the Ottoman Sultan Ibrahim the Fine, known as Ibrahim the Mad. Here's what's crucial. Ibrahim wasn't considered mad until he'd already inherited absolute power. As a younger prince, confined to the palace quarters, he was unremarkable. But once he became sultan, with access to unlimited resources and no oversight, behavior escalated into what we might call psychosis. The power didn't reveal a hidden madness. It created one. Brings us to something genuinely terrifying. If power creates or exacerbates these behaviors, history's darkest figures aren't aberrations we can simply identify and remove from power. They're products. They're what the system manufactures. And that means throughout history, countless reasonable people who would have been kind neighbors, friends, concerned parents in different circumstances, became tyrants the moment they inherited thrones. We see this in the lives of rulers who were beloved by their inner circles but despised by their people. Austrian Emperor Franz Joseph was known to be gentle, even timid in private. His policies, shaped by his absolute authority, and the men around him who benefited from his power, resulted in the deaths of thousands. Kindness in his chambers meant nothing to the soldiers he sent to their deaths. Deepest horror of studying these figures isn't that they were uniquely evil. It's that they remind us of a painful truth. Systems matter more than individuals. The structure that puts one person in absolute control over millions, no accountability, and no consequence for cruelty will eventually produce cruelty. It's not a character flaw, a feature of how power operates without checks. This is why studying the sanity of historical rulers is actually less important than studying systems that made them rulers in the first place. A deeper dive into how power structures enabled some of history's cruelest figures and how other civilizations tried to prevent this through checks and balances is available in the description and pinned comment if you want to understand actual mechanics of tyranny. The uncomfortable implication is this: if we built systems where power is concentrated, where accountability is absent, and where the powerful are isolated from consequence, we shouldn't be shocked when those systems produce cruel behavior. We shouldn't look for madness as an explanation. We should look at the structure itself. Every civilization that tried to prevent tyranny did so not by finding better kings, by limiting kingship itself. The Magna Carta wasn't signed because King John was suddenly kind, forced upon him because the structure of absolute monarchy had produced enough cruelty that the nobles demanded constraints. American founders didn't trust in finding virtuous presidents. They built checks and balances because they understood something fundamental. Power itself is corrupting, regardless of who wields it. The kings who lost their sanity, or appeared to, were often just the ones who lost the ability to hide it. The ones whose power was so absolute that they didn't need to pretend anymore. In a way, their madness was honesty, was what the structure of unchecked power produces when nobody is around to question it. Build mythology around the individual genius of leaders and the individual evil of tyrants because it's comforting. It suggests that good governance is about finding good people. But the evidence of history whispers something much darker. It's about building systems that make it impossible for power to be used unchecked. Power, any power, will eventually be abused by anyone who wields it absolutely. Kings who lost their minds were often the ones brave enough or desperate enough to stop performing sanity. And that terrifying realization, understanding of how fragile rationality becomes under the weight of absolute authority, perhaps the most important lesson history can teach us about power itself. If you want to explore the psychological mechanisms that turned ordinary men into historical horrors, and the rare rulers who somehow resisted this corruption, check the description and pinned comment for a comprehensive breakdown of how isolation, power, human psychology intersect in ways that reshape history. The truth is waiting there. Thank you for descending into the darker corners of history with me today. Stories matter because they're not just about the past. They're warnings about the nature of power itself. Found this unsettling and eye-opening? I'd deeply appreciate it if you'd hit that subscribe button, give this video a like, turn on the notification bell so you never miss when we uncover the next horror buried in history. New uploads every week. Welcome to the Throne of Horrors.